Welcome back to Science and Sports. Believe it or not, this is episode 20. I'm your host, Simon Heidenreich. So, big thanks to all of you who've been listening. Today, we've got a very special guest, Andrew Langford, Director of the International University's Strength and Conditioning Association. Andrew holds a Master of Science degree and is an accredited international strength and conditioning practitioner. He also has a Master Strength and Conditioning Practitioner certificate. Today we're diving into some big questions. Why being a scientific practitioner might be the most powerful approach in modern strength and conditioning, whether Olympic weightlifting truly deserves its gold standard status, and how we can build strength and power more effectively in today's ever evolving athletic landscape. Have fun in today's episode. This podcast is presented by Like Me, your partner for social media and online marketing from Weiden, and Praxis im Salzhaus, your contact for physiotherapy and health in Altenstadt. Okay, Andrew, thank you so much for your time that you joined me today on my podcast. Can you give me a little background of yourself and maybe tell me a little bit about your current work as the director of the International University Strength and Conditioning Association?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Andrew Langford from the UK. Um, Kind of my experience in strength and conditioning has been quite varied. I originally went to the US to university playing basketball and studied a degree in biology. Kind of with a big interest, obviously, in sport and sports performance, and worked kind of. Uh, Within the sports teams there like an intern basis, but my background was very much kind of in the sciences, biology. Um, Came back to the UK and played professionally a little bit in the UK, and then went to Leeds Beckett University to do my master's degree, which was in exercise physiology. Um, and then started working quite heavily within strength and conditioning. So worked with some of the university teams there and local professional rugby team. Um, and then following that, I worked with Great Britain basketball as a strength and conditioning coach for quite a number of years. And then worked at Sheffield Hallam University as the lead strength and conditioning coach for all of our Team Hallam
Mhm.
teams and athletes, which include a lot of high performance and kind of a GB, Team GB, Olympic athletes and things like that. So worked with a real huge range of sports and teams. Um, and then yeah, came to the role that I'm doing now. So during that time at Sheffield Hallam, I still had a lot of contacts from universities in the US, people I knew in the US, and we would discuss kind of the differences between UK and US universities. And kind of in the sports context, they are quite different. Obviously, there's huge amounts of money in collegiate sport in the US, so the departments are totally different to what you find in the UK. But there is some real good athletes within the UK because the UK doesn't have the eligibility requirements. So
Mhm.
you often get professional athletes also competing at university level, and you get this real strange mix. So we'd have really good discussions around similarities, differences, what we could do. Um, and we kind of had this informal group that would meet on Zoom calls and email discussions. And we soon had interest from academic departments because at that time, universities in the UK, a lot of degrees in strength and conditioning were coming out. Every university wanted to have a degree in strength and conditioning. So we soon had a lot of interest from the academic side of things. And also for us as practitioners, we wanted to make sure that those degrees were as good as possible. You know, they weren't just universities that had a bit of a sports science degree with one extra module or um, a PE teacher teaching the course on strength and conditioning. We wanted them to actually be really good and effective. So we looked at what we could do to improve those standards. and whether it was possible for universities that were a really good standard to be able to award an accreditation certification at the
Mhm.
end of it. So um, we formalized the group, we formalized the company back in 2019 as the International University Strength and Conditioning Association. And then that soon grew into what it is now, where it's a global collaborative. We've got over 150 universities worldwide that we work with on a variety of areas of that, including the degree accreditation. On major universities who've gone through the degree accreditation, such as Leeds Becker University, St Mary's, Salford, universities in the US like Springfield College, Sacred Heart University, and we're doing other universities worldwide now. We published the International Journal of Strength and Conditioning, which was originally intended as a bit of a bridging the gap idea between research and practice, recognizing that S&C is an applied science, and we wanted to get practitioners within organizations able to contribute to the scientific literature, which typically they don't, because you've got to pay a lot of money to publish a paper and you've got to be affiliated with the university. And we wanted to remove those barriers. So we created the journal where it's what's called Diamond Open Access, which means essentially anyone would be able to submit a paper, publish a paper. It still goes through the traditional peer review checks and everything else. And that's been really successful. We've got major support from leading universities worldwide on that, like MIT and Yale. University of Bath helped fund that and support that. And then we do a lot of other kind of placement exchange stuff, intern exchange. Um, we publish a lot of guidelines, resources for practitioners in the industry, and do a lot of work on that in that regard. So yeah, that kind of brings us up to date now.
That's a pretty interesting and exciting field of area you're working in at the moment. You said that you played basketball and have been a strength and conditioning coach for the national team. Um, are you still working with pro athletes at the time?
Currently, I don't do as much hands-on coaching anymore. I do. I work with one boxer, two-time world champion, featherweight, which is still good. So that gives me a little bit of that uh, hands-on time to
Mhm.
work. A couple of times a week, and working in that context, which I think is really important as a strength and conditioning practitioner to keep on working with athletes. So that's the only hands-on work I do at the moment.
I'm just asking because we talked a little bit upfront about the importance of being um, a scientific practitioner in the sports and strength and conditioning branch. Why is it, in your eyes, that important to have the academic theory combined with the coaching in the practice?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that is the optimal way to work within strength and conditioning, is to have that combination of academic knowledge, scientific background, and then the applied knowledge. S&C is it is an applied science. Um, in any given scenario or situation that you're working with a team or an athlete, you won't be able to find an exact research study on that environment that you're working in, those circumstances, under those scenarios, with that type of athlete. It's just not possible. Um, so, uh, in order for you to be effective, what you really need to be able to do is look at underlying principles of science. So, the basics like uh, ultimately chemistry, physics, biology, but obviously going into specifics like physiology, anatomy, biomechanics. But all of these fundamental principles, you need a really good understanding of that, so then you can uh, make your best guess at how to apply those in any given situation. So the better you understand those fundamental principles, the better you can then um, kind of decide on how to apply them in these given situations. And then obviously once you're in the given situation, It's then about having experience in those environments and how to apply them in those different situations, understanding that different personalities work in different ways and different situations demand different things, and different sports, when a sports coach says, well, we're not training today, we'll train tomorrow, and it totally alters what the program is and everything else. So it, yeah, you do really need that combination, and going too heavily in one direction uh, won't serve you very well. So if you only care about that applied side, but you've never really looked at the underlying principles of science, then you can easily get steered off track and led down blind alleys. And as human beings, we have a lot of cognitive biases, and you can believe certain things that are actually wrong. So you can't fully just lie in that area of my personal experience and what I think.
Mhm.
But then equally, like I said before, you can't just go on well, what does the science say? Because you're not going to find the perfect scientific
Yeah.
rationale in that given environment. So you really need to be able to synthesize the two and bring it together. And that's why I like the term strength and conditioning practitioner or scientific practitioner for our role, because I think that is where the optimal uh, the optimal balance is.
But how do you think? I'm totally with you. If you only know the academic part of it and you can't really use it or apply it in a coaching lesson, or other way around, you're just not a complete scientific practitioner, as you say. But how is it possible, or for, let's say, people who just graduated, have the degrees in their hands, or maybe the guys who go the opposite way and are ex-pro athletes who now do the strength and conditioning part? How is it possible to bridge the gap between the two fields? Because I think when we talk about it, it sounds pretty easy, but in the real world, it's more challenging than just to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's part of the reason why we put together our degree accreditation the way we have. So within our degree accreditation with the IUSCA, we've asked universities to show how they embed all of these fundamental principles of science within the curriculum, and then how they give students a lot of practical experience, both in the S&C facilities there and working with um, learning techniques and principles and testing and all that kind of stuff, but then also applied practice of how they get internships and placements and work experience and all of that. So we've tried to embed that within the degree accreditation programs that we do. I think that's a really effective way to do it. But I'm also aware that, like you say, not everyone has gone through that pathway or has the ability to go through that pathway. So in that case, you need to figure out which area you're probably lacking. If you just came through a sports science degree, then maybe you're going to need to go out and get a lot of practical experience, which could be volunteer work, placement work, all of that time just spent in those environments, learning from practitioners, getting those hours under your belt where you're experiencing these things. If you are a pro athlete who's come through, wants to get into S&C, then probably you're going to have to need to go and uh, do some of the background research, maybe take some courses where you can learn about these underlying principles of science. And that's really important. So, kind of looking at which scenario suits you. And then I'd say that with the one other thing that's going to be really important, I think, for anyone is when I talk about like science and being a scientific practitioner, it's not just the underlying scientific principles, the facts, it's scientific values, as in clear scientific thinking. So using principles of like reason, rationality, logic, um, basic statistical evidence. The values of science are really one of the most important things that we can do as practitioners. because that's how we can kind of evaluate situations. And as I say, like, because we have so many inbuilt biases as human beings, it's really important to do that to ensure that what we're doing is effective.
Yeah, 100%, you're right. But what I'm interested in after hearing you talk for 10, 15 minutes and discussing the combination of the theory and the practical use, do you think after your current work with working with a lot of universities and giving them a proper, not degree, but a proper work with the strength and conditioning program or sports science, let's say it like that, do you think the universities prepare upcoming sports scientists good enough all around the world, just based on your experience?
Um, some universities do. Um, some probably do not. And that is one of the, and it's probably the same across any academic discipline
Yeah.
where there will be some doing a better job than others. I think the challenge within universities is the fact that it is that applied science if you want it to be strength and conditioning. So there certainly are lots of degrees that have done things like the sports science or exercise science, and they probably do those pretty well. But once they start coming into this strength and conditioning field, it's that challenge to be able to give enough of that practical experience where the students are getting the chance to learn techniques and coaching and applied practice and all of that kind of stuff. And that's probably where the majority of universities fall down. But it is improving because, as I say, for if they want to get an accreditation like ours through the IUSCA, they have to show that they're doing those things. Um, some universities struggle with that. Some can't go through the accreditation process yet because they're not embedding enough practical experience. They're not embedding those types of things.
Hmm.
Um, but certainly, there are a lot that are trying to do it and working to do that. So I'd say that on the whole, it is improving.
Yeah. Okay. Before moving on to a second topic I wanted to talk to you about, I have one more question. What just came to my mind during our talk. I took the route of being a pro hockey player for 6 or 7 years, and during my hockey career, I started doing my bachelor in sports science, doing my master in sports science, and now working for 3 or 4 years as a sports scientist and strength and conditioning coach in ice hockey. Do you think it's important, or do you think you have a bigger value to a team, not specialized in hockey, but in general, if you played the sport before you turn to a coach in the same sport? Do you think it's important to have this background, or do you say you can still get around it, you can learn it, you can adapt, and still be a very good strength and conditioning coach?
I think you probably can. I probably come from it as my personal perspective is probably a little bit biased because I came through the playing of the sport
Yeah.
background. So from my personal perspective, I feel like that is highly valuable
Hmm.
because I've experienced what it's like playing the sport, having the daily demands, being in those environments with different coaches, um, training and being tired and sore and going out after games and staying out late drinking alcohol because you won a big game and um, all of these different factors which you might not necessarily understand if you haven't been in those environments. Um, so I certainly see value in that, and I think it is valuable. I found it valuable in the work that I've done because I feel like I can relate to those teams and athletes probably easier than if I haven't been in those environments. But equally, I know lots and lots of very, very good practitioners who've never been good at sport or never played sport at high level and do a very
Mhm.
good job. So, it's probably just my personal bias that's giving that opinion.
Probably when you have the right dedication to the field you want to work in, it's surely possible. But I just was interested in your personal view as well. Um, but going away a little bit from the sports science or the strength and conditioning in general to a little bit more specific aspect in the regular training basis is the Olympic weightlifting I'm interested in. So we're talking about cleans, snatches, jerks. I experienced it in my time playing youth ice hockey. We had a Olympic weightlifting coach who worked with us multiple days a week. Is it really the gold standard in your eyes?
That is, it's a very interesting question. It's somewhat controversial, I feel, in the S&C space. I think um, certainly in the UK, quite a lot in the US as well. I'm not so sure about other parts of the world, but Olympic weightlifting seems to be seen as this gold standard, this magical, almost magical exercise that you have to do uh, to optimize sports performance, and that's the best way to improve sports performance. And I guess because I came from into S&C from a more pure science background, from a biology background, and trained in scientific thinking, I tend to have a bit of a skeptical viewpoint on kind of claims like this. That
Mhm.
you know, so I like to look at the evidence and see what's there. And for me, I can't see any clear evidence or rationale as to why Olympic weightlifting should inherently be superior. I think if you look at it from a fundamental physiological perspective, you consider how muscles generate force and how the velocity of contraction is dependent on uh, the load that's opposing it. Um, and you kind of know that there's no given single exercise that's going to change what a muscle is capable of doing.
Mhm.
Essentially, what we're doing with different exercises is we're imposing different demands in terms of how quickly it's going to be able to contract, and that could be with a whole range of exercise and a whole range of loads. And if we're doing that maximally, that's going to elicit certain adaptations. I can't see how an Olympic weightlift does anything that another exercise couldn't do, eh, given certain circumstances and constraints. And I think the the research backs up what I'm kind of thinking as well, in that
Mhm.
all the research shows time and time again is that Olympic weightlifting is not superior to weightlifting, normal traditional, squats, deadlifts, plus some plyometrics.
Mhm.
And that makes perfect rational sense to me, because you're training the muscle through those different um, stimuluses, such as against high loads, against low loads, using things like stretch shortening cycle, all of that kind of stuff. You can do through a huge variety of exercises. So it makes perfect sense that there's no reason why an Olympic lift should be any superior. I would even then go one step further and say Olympic lifting is arguably worse because there is a unique characteristic to Olympic lifting, which is they're highly technical, far
Yeah.
more technical than pretty much any other exercise you'll find within strength and conditioning. Thus, the ability of an individual to perform them with maximal intent is typically greatly reduced. So if you go into any given environment, and I've been into hundreds and hundreds of team environments, as part of the work I do, as part of the work I have done, where they're trying to do Olympic lifts, I've only seen a very, very small handful of those places where the athletes are really performing them with maximal intent.
Mm-hmm.
So my argument would be that you're better off using, in most circumstances, using the other methods because it's far easier to get the athletes to perform them with maximal intent and therefore get the adaptations that you're wanting. I think that you can also take that line of thinking down. How much time are you wasting trying to teach these athletes these highly complex lifts? Do the athletes enjoy spending all this time learning these highly complex lifts when they could have better time spent doing something else? Is there any interference effect with learning highly complex lifts when they're learning highly complex skills in their playing environment? There's a lot of different facts I think you could go into. But that would be my personal take on the situation. And I know it is highly controversial. I think because there is some crossover with weightlifting. I think a lot of probably people who were Olympic weightlifters went into strength and conditioning because there's some crossover. I think there's a lot of weightlifting enthusiasts who are strength and conditioning coaches, and then
Mm-hmm.
it becomes this almost tribalistic, dogmatic viewpoint that this is better, and now you have to believe what I'm saying and be in the Olympic weightlifting tribe, if you like. And then you get the critiques that, oh, if you don't use Olympic weightlifting, it's just because you can't coach, or critiques like that. And I feel like it's just a very dogmatic viewpoint with a very little evidence base.
I was really a big fan of cleaning back in the days because I think it's, like you said, a really technical drill. What can be a pro, but also obviously a con in a given time, thing, because it limits you if you don't have the ability to make it that the quality is there, because it is very technical. The maybe risk of injury goes up. I'm not a big fan, or I was, but now I'm not, of the snatches, because it's, if I talk to my players in my hockey team, they don't have a big experience in Olympic weightlifting. So I think it's, the risk of an injury is too high. And like you said, I have to, I'm on the same page as you again. I think you can do the same or have the same result, the positive result, from, let's say, cleaning, jerking, snatching. If you do, for example, loaded jumps after some squats, if you do medicine ball work, like explosive work. And I think that's um, the big quality that those Olympic lifts have, is the explosiveness. But like you just said, or like I think, you can implement a lot of other drills, and it's backed up by scientific papers, by articles, that is, that you can do it another way. What's less a risk of injury, what's maybe more interesting, sport specific wise, let's say for a hockey player, the squatting, the jumping. I think it's easier for the athletes to understand or get their head around that it's the same outcome, but it's more sports or sports specific. And I think that's a reason why it's good to, if you can do it, but I think you can also do it an easier way, less fatiguing way, and with the same outcome at the end. Speaking of the explosive qualities that those drill have, what are, in your opinion, some core principles of developing speed, developing explosiveness for a high performance athlete?
Yeah, so I think there are some fundamental basics that you need to get in place for all performance. Um, Going back to kind of what I touched on before about how a muscle produces um, force. Ultimately, that's going to be the basis for a lot of our physical performance and what we're trying to develop in S&C. So, a lot of that maximal strength work is going to be very important. as a base, the more force that a muscle is able to produce, that is potential to be then applied in different contexts in terms of velocity and then the explosive qualities we're looking at. Um, we can see that in lots of research when we look at things like the load velocity profiling,
Mm-hmm.
where if we increase the uh, that maximal um, force a muscle can produce, that how quickly it can move a given load, then at any submaximal load from that, it's going to be able to move it quicker than if it wasn't able to produce as much force. So we know that being able to produce more force means that potentially it's going to be able to contract at a higher velocity. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a fundamental principle number one. Obviously, then it seems like given we know there are principles of specificity to adaptation that by training at faster speeds, the body is probably going to adapt to be able to do those as well. So once we give it that capacity to contract at quicker speeds, we probably want to then do some kind of training where we are actually working at those quicker speeds. So that's where our things like um, loaded jumps, plyometrics, sprinting, medicine ball stuff. That's where all that's going to come in. But obviously, like I said, that heavy maximum force stuff needs to come first because we need those qualities first. Once we then develop that, then we can go down and then work on perhaps heavy loaded jumps later on, moderately loaded jumps later on, light jumps, and then
Yeah.
plyometrics, things like that. And then that brings us to the other aspects of force development or power development or speed, which is it's not just the muscle contracting. It's things like the stretch shortening cycle, the ability of the tendon or fascia to transfer forces. So with things like that, they're not force generating like a muscle is that actually generates the force, but they're transferring the force either from the muscle or from gravity or whatever
Mm-hmm.
else. So the better we're able to train the body to transmit those other forces, the more we're going to be able to put it into sports performance. So again, that's where our things like our jump training, our plyometrics, our medicine ball work is going to be able to overload those type of things. So um, and again, going back to that maximum strength work, that's where some of that is important before, because that helps develop the robustness and qualities within the tendons and muscle fibers to be able to withstand some of that later dynamic work that we're going to want to do
Mm-hmm.
with those tissues. So it all kind of stems back from that early strength work, that early force development work, which is going to then give us the prerequisites we need to work on all of those other qualities.
So to sum it up a little bit, um, if you talk about the periodization, building muscles comes before maximum strength and explosive strength. It just builds on top of each other. You have to have the foundation to develop the, let's say, in the off season to develop the rest for to the start of the competitive season. I heard a different approach the other day, um, which I wanted to ask you about your experience with it, maybe, or your take on it. It's the velocity based training. Can you give me a little explanation about that, or a little yeah, take what you think about it in comparison to the regular program or the periodization model I just mentioned?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think velocity-based training perhaps is used in different contexts, and people mean it to mean different things. For me, velocity-based training is simply uh, using velocity as a measure for intensity. So for me, and when I've used something like velocity-based training, it's when I'm doing my maximal strength work, for instance. I will know that when I'm doing a heavy squat, if I measure the mean velocity, the athlete will probably be performing anywhere between zero point 0.3 and zero point 0.5 meters a second. That
Mhm.
lets me know the intensity they're working at. When I then later on in the training plan decide to work on um, lower load, so we're moving faster. Maybe the athlete now is working at zero point 0.8 meters a second or 1 meter a second.
Mhm.
And then when we're doing the ballistic explosive jumps and things like that, maybe I'm looking at a peak velocity and they're hitting 3 meters a second on a repeated barbell jump or something. Um, so that's how I use velocity based training. I don't see that as different to what we discussed. It's just using velocity based training as a metric to essentially determine intensity that we're looking at.
Okay, so to to have the right circumstances or to see the right results, you need some technology aspect too, right? For that kind of training to see the velocity of the bar or the speed the athlete produces. Is there any way you can do it without modern technology?
I mean, if you look kind of historically at coaching in S&C, or even when I was younger and didn't have these technologies, coach's eye
Yeah.
is not the worst method in the world if you are an experienced coach, and that comes back to being that experienced practitioner where you've had a lot of time in the field and you understand it, and you can kind of see when someone is moving slow and
Mhm.
close to failure. You can see when someone's moving fast. It's obviously not as good as if you have the data, and that is the whole point of kind of having these technologies and these data, is that it gives you a much better understanding of what's actually happening.
Mhm.
But obviously, if you have situations or circumstances where you don't have that capability, then uh, you can go off how quickly it looks, how quickly the athlete feels it's moving. You can ask the athlete how difficult they think it is, things like RPE scores. Um, there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of rules of thumb that you can use to estimate those types of things. It's just the velocity measures give you a much more precise idea of what's actually there. I guess the point of it is, and what we shouldn't forget, the point of all of these technologies is to give us a better idea of what the underlying adaptation is. So, for instance, with the velocity readings, we don't actually really care what the velocities are. What we wanting to know is um, at a very slow velocity, we're going to assume that assuming that the athlete's doing it at maximal intent, that the load on the bar is very high. So when we think about our load velocity profile, we know that we're in that domain where the muscle fibers are opposing a lot of force, and not there's quite slow turnover of cross bridge formation.
Mhm.
So we know that we're overloading the adaptation in that way. When the velocity of the bar is fast, we know that the muscle isn't going to be in that uh, resistive phase. There's going to be a lot of cross bridge cycle formation, more. So we know that we're overloading and hopefully having an adaptation effect in that aspect. So everything we should think about really should go back to what adaptation we're hoping it's producing. And that's why I think we get confused sometimes with metrics. We look at force plate data like rate of force development, for instance,
Mhm.
which can be very confusing because depending on the type of exercise, we don't. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the underlying physiological mechanism or the adaptation that we're causing. Because if you look at something like rate of force development on a vertical, counter movement jump,
Yeah.
it, the rate of force development, it's not really telling you what because you can achieve the outcome through a variety of different means. Um, so, for instance, rate of force development on something like an isometric mid thigh pull is
Mhm.
huge, because you're opposing this immovable force, and you can just generate as quickly
Yeah.
as you can. So you get a huge rate of force development score. If it's just in a concentric, um, barbell squat,
Yeah.
then rate of force development's going to be a lot slower. If you have a stretch shortening cycle action, rate of force development's going to be um, really high if it's a very reactive, quick, short.
Mhm.
You know, one if it's a deeper, longer jump, counter movement jump where you're someone who goes down quite a lot and comes up, it's going to be a lower rate of force development. And so in any given exercise, you've got this complex interplay of all these different physiological factors. The concentric muscle action, the stretch shortening cycle, potential aspects where different muscles are in isometric contractions. These all get muddled up in these complex exercises we do. And then we'll look at something like rate of force development, but we've got no idea which combination of all those factors I just mentioned have made up that number. So
Mhm.
it doesn't really tell us anything. So we've got to be quite careful with what metrics we want to look at and what metrics we want to use, because ultimately we want to know what we're overloading or what adaptations we're hoping to elicit.
Yeah. There was a lot to a lot to think about. It's right there at the end. Um, to before I want to wrap the episode up with you, I have one more question, a little funnier question where you also have to think a little bit about it, maybe. But to end it on a light note, if you could only do 5 more exercises for the rest of your life, what would it be and why?
uh,
Not based for high performance, just for you personally to get around.
I mean that's pretty much all I do now anyway. um, what I found that just works quite well for me to sustain um, decent health and physique, um, is I pretty much do that five or six exercises. I do one set, about 20 repetitions, so just pretty much to failure of 20 repetitions. I do a squat exercise, I do a bench press, I do a pull down, I do a shoulder press, I do a row, a pull. So they're probably the main exercise, and then I'll sometimes just throw in some biceps, triceps, and some
Some
abs.
additional
But
work.
I literally just do one set of 20 reps where it's taking it pretty much to failure. Um, with whatever weight I do to go to failure on that. So it's super quick. I get through it in like 20 minutes. I do
Per
that twice a
day?
week. I do it about twice a week. I've
Okay.
been doing that for about the last 2 years because my after years of training as an athlete and things like that, my
Yeah.
kind of motivation to go in and train a lot and be in the gym all the time isn't that high. So I've been doing that for about 2 years, and I've maintained pretty much all of my muscle size and strength and everything just doing that.
Yeah.
Um, Whether that's just for me personally, given my physique and whatever underlying factors, but for me that works really well, and I'm quite happy doing that.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I'll try that out for sure later today. Your workout
You,
plan.
you just have to make sure. The challenge is you have to make sure that those 20 reps are really, really hard. So it needs
Mhm.
to be like where rep 17, 18, 19, you're really struggling, really straining. If you get to the 20 reps and you're not at that phase, then you didn't have a heavy enough weight. Mm,
Yeah,
do
let's
some more
see.
reps, keep going.
I'm
But
excited.
it's good.
Okay, Andrew, thank you so much for your time, your
Yep.
insights, and your information about the importance of being a scientific practitioner about the Olympic weightlifting, and also that we talked a little bit in depth about strength and power development. I would like to talk to you again. And until there, I wish you all the best and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Science and Sports. If you enjoyed my podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Your feedback is very important to me, so I look forward to your ratings and comments on your favorite podcast platform. Feel free to share the podcast with friends, colleagues, and anyone interested in sports science, athletics, performance, and health. Together, we can inspire even more people about this exciting topic.